weapons you're sending collectively? And secondly, how uncomfortable does it make you feel that by rolling out a no-fly zone, by ruling out NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, and by refusing to give any sort of indication of red lines, that really the only end to this is when President Putin decides he's had enough?
Thanks very much, Nick. And you're right to put your finger on the agony that everybody feels in this group, all Western countries, the whole of NATO, the G7, about our inability to do more to help given the constraints we face. And I think it's fair to say that there isn't a Western democracy that's currently contemplating putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. And we've got to be clear about that. Nor is there a country that is willing to enforce a no-fly zone in the way that we would so like to, but unfortunately it does mean air-to-ground attacks on Russian air defences, and it does mean taking down Russian fast jets and asking the RAF to do that. That's not something that any country here is contemplating. What we are doing is steadily ratcheting up the movement of lethal but defensive weaponry to Ukraine, and that is growing in volume the whole time. And what the Americans are doing and what they have done is really quite extraordinary already, and the UK is proud of what we've contributed. I'll go to Sam Coates of Sky.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Sam Coates of Sky News. President Zelensky, interestingly, didn't repeat his call for a no-fly zone when he addressed NATO leaders. Instead, he was very, very specific. He wants tanks and jets. Are NATO members, is the United Kingdom going to give him tanks and jets? And if not, why not?
Thanks, Sam. He did indeed call for tanks, and there's a particular reason for that. What President Zelensky wants is to try to relieve Mariupol and to help the thousands of Ukrainian fighters in the city. To that end, he does need armour as he sees it. We're looking at what we can do to help, but I've got to tell you, logistically at the moment, it looks very difficult, but both with armour and with jets. We're very conscious of what he's asking for. At the moment, we're looking at the equipment that we think is more immediately valuable is missiles that will enable the Ukrainians to protect themselves against bombardment from the air, but also to deal with the Grad rocket launchers, the Russian heavy artillery. That is doing such death and dealing such death and destruction in the cities. And there, I think, if we can really help them, that would be extremely valuable, because they need protection from that absolutely merciless onslaught from artillery and from the rocket launchers. James Mates, ITV.
Prime Minister, you've also spoken about weaning Europe off Russian oil and gas. There'll be a discussion tonight that you won't be part of at the European Council. Is Europe doing enough? Are the Germans doing enough? What will Britain do to help other countries who rely more on Russian oil and gas to wean themselves off it?
Thanks, James. Look, and I just want to say that this is easier for some countries than it is for others, and everybody can see that. And clearly, the dependency in Germany and in Italy is very strong, and there are many other European countries that depend on Russian gas. But what they're all doing is moving to extricate themselves from that position and to avoid being blackmailed by Vladimir Putin. And I think that what Olaf Scholz has done, the steps that they're taking, I think it's heroic. And I applaud what Germany is doing. They've set themselves deadlines to move away from oil and gas. I don't think it'll be easy. And the Italians are doing the same. I don't think it'll be easy for them. But it's the right thing to do in the long term, in the medium term. And we will help. Of course, and one of the ways that I think we should all work together is in the sharing and the development of alternative provision, not least wind power. I mean, the Baltic countries, for instance, are heavily dependent on gas, but they have a fantastic future as generators of clean renewable energy. We want to help that. We have a lot of experience of it. Jason Gretz, Daily Mail.
Thanks, Prime Minister. The Kremlin has named you today as their public enemy #1, saying you're leading the kind of anti-Russian resistance internationally. I wondered why you thought that had happened, whether you thought we were going to get any blowback back home from that, and how you feel about it. And you just mentioned wind farms. Is the price of all this going to be sort of going back to having more onshore wind farms back home?
Okay, well, a couple of points there, Jason. First of all, I think it's very, very important for everybody to understand that I don't think there's a single person round the table in NATO or the G7 who is against Russians or the Russian people. Absolutely not. Least of all me. I think I'm probably the only Prime Minister in UK history to be called Boris. You know, I have that distinction, and I'm not remotely anti-Russian, but I think what we all agree is that what Vladimir Putin is doing, the way he's leading Russia at the moment, is utterly catastrophic, that his invasion of Ukraine is inhuman and barbaric, and the conduct of that invasion is now moving into the type of behaviour that, as I said before, we haven't seen in the continent of Europe for 80 years, and it's horrific. So you can be sympathetic towards ordinary Russians who are being so badly led, but you can be deeply hostile to the decisions of Vladimir Putin, the way he's leading his country. And you had another question about onshore wind. Look, I want to be clear. I think the massive opportunity for the UK is in offshore wind, and we've got good at that. We were, until very recently, I'm slightly to my irritation, we seem to be overtaken now by China, but we were until recently the biggest producer of offshore wind in the world. And one of the things I want to be setting out in the forthcoming British energy security strategy is how we can regain our lead as the #1 and where we're going to be doing it. And I think you can do it in a completely environmentally friendly way. You can generate phenomenal quantities of renewable energy at zero marginal cost, and it is the way forward. Euronews, Meave McMahon. No Euronews. Forgive me. I'm going to go to Natasha Clark from The Sun. Natasha.
Jens Stoltenberg said earlier today that there will be severe consequences if Russia does go ahead and use chemical weapons in Ukraine. What does that mean? Does it mean boots on the ground, or is that something that we're completely ruling out already? And you said earlier that you'd like to see Ukraine handed the hosting of the next World Cup. Would you like to see them automatically qualify for this year's World Cup?
Right, okay, so first of all, on chemical, biological, tactical nuclear weapons, all of these are viewed with utter horror by people around the table today. I just heard from my friend Fumio Kishida, who represents the only country in the G7 actually to have experienced nuclear weapons on his, or has seen his country attacked by nuclear weapons. There is a visceral horror of the use of these weapons of mass destruction. I think that if Putin were to engage in anything like that, the consequences would be very, very severe. You have to have a bit of ambiguity about your response, but I think it would be catastrophic for him if he were to do that. And I think that he understands that. But you know, when you look at what he's saying, I think Joe Biden is right to warn, because you know, when the Russians start doing this stuff about there are factories in Ukraine producing American biological weaponry, you know that is a prelude to a false flag operation, and they could well do something. But I think it would be a profound and a disastrous mistake for Putin were he to do that. On Ukraine qualifying for the European, is it the European? I'm not. Look, football is not my best subject. As you, the World Cup. You mean, should they be given a buy and qualify automatically? Sounds like a good idea to me, but I'm out of area here. I've got to admit that's not my strong subject. I don't see why not. Is my view. James, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to comment on that, James. I'm not going to comment on that. Let's go to. Look, let me put it this way: given what Ukraine has been going through, given the privations that Ukrainian footballers have had to endure, I'm sure that every possible sympathy and allowances should be made for them. Let me put it that way. How about that? Let's go to Natalia Drozdiak from Bloomberg.
Yeah, I'm right here. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I just had two quick questions. On the nuclear threat, how concrete is that? Can you give us a sense of those discussions? And secondly, you mentioned this morning that allies are examining ways to stop Putin from using Russia's gold reserves. Could you tell us whether those discussions have moved on today? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. So I think it's very important to stress that I think that the discussion of the use of nuclear weapons is a distraction, and it's intended to be a distraction from what is really going on. And that is a savage attack with conventional means on innocent people in urban centers in Ukraine. Absolutely barbaric use of artillery and mortars and rockets as I've described, thermobaric bombs included, it now seems. That is what is going on. And what we're talking about is the right of the Ukrainian people to be equipped with the weapons to defend themselves. And all discussion of nuclear weapons is intended to frame this as a confrontation between Russia as a nuclear power and other nuclear powers. That's not what's going on. What's going on is a confrontation between Russia and entirely innocent people in Ukraine. That's what it's between. And what we're trying to do is help those people. And I think that is morally the right thing to do. On gold reserves, there is evidence that the Russians may be trying to get round. I mean, the Russians are obviously going to try to get round the sanctions on their gold, and we're taking steps to try to make sure that there's no leakage, no sale of bullion into markets around the world. Now, and that's what we're working on. Last question to Steve Swinford of The Times.
Prime Minister, just to come back to Natasha's question, we heard from from a Western official today that if Russia did use chemical weapons in Ukraine, it would be highly unlikely that there would be a military intervention from NATO. Can I just clarify, are you in that position, or would you rule that out, or do you think it's possible that we could have a military intervention? Is it something you're prepared to consider?
I just want to repeat the answer I gave to Natasha, which is I think that any such action would be not only morally repugnant, indefensible, but disastrous for Putin as well. And I think, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there and rush for the plane under strict instructions. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
You've just been listening there to British Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking at NATO headquarters in Brussels. We are awaiting a news conference from US President Joe Biden in the next half hour. For now, I want to go straight to our David McKenzie, who joins us live from our London bureau. And David, the big question we've been hearing coming out of the G7 and NATO is how much more can the West do to help Ukraine? And today, the British Prime Minister saying that they're going to double their lethal aid to date.
Well, that's right. They are doubling down on their lethal aid to the country. But what they're not doing is also critical here. And you heard Prime Minister Boris Johnson there using the logistical argument, saying that to get planes and armor into Ukraine would be difficult. But frankly, it's been a refrain throughout the day. Despite the calls from NATO allies and from the European Union more broadly that they need to give lethal aid, including drones and RPGs and defensive weapons, as they call it, to the Ukraine to stop the Russian invasion, they have drawn this line in terms of armor and jets and other more sophisticated weapon systems to get to that country. And you saw President Zelensky saying earlier that they could just give 1% of their overall the money that is spent on defense throughout the NATO bloc, and that would do the job. But they are still reticent to get deeply involved in this conflict. All of the leaders saying that the last thing they want is their troops facing directly with Russian troops. Linda?
And that is the big fear, right? An escalation, and that is something they want to prevent. So Britain saying they're going to send 6,000 missiles, $25 million pounds. But certainly ruling out the no-fly zone and not sending in NATO troops on the ground. And certainly not even outlining the consequences to those red lines that they've outlined should Vladimir Putin use chemical or biological weapons.
Well, as each leader has said that this is a red line, the use of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear would be crossing, of course, a red line. But a few of them going into any kind of detail of what it would mean from a NATO perspective if that worst case scenario happens. It was interesting to hear Boris Johnson say, in his mind, this is a distraction. He said that while the talk has been about this kind of doomsday scenario, right now, as we speak, as he put it, that Russian artillery is raining down on Ukrainian cities, and civilians have been roundly killed and maimed and injured by this invasion, and that is where the focus should be right now.
All right, our David McKenzie for us in London. Thanks for being with us. I'm Linda Kincaid. Stay with us for our continuing coverage of the war in Ukraine. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
When we wanted to move faster and see more of the world, we found a way. We also found ways to connect beyond boundaries. And when an unprecedented pandemic tried to derail us, we found ways to get ahead.
Are we ready?
Ready.
Ready.
Ready. Ready.
As your bank, we have stayed proactive, creating dynamic solutions and leveraging cutting-edge technology to drive global expansion into new markets. We rolled up our sleeves to be human together, doing more, innovating smarter, and always showing up for you. So come on board, let's give you more.
Access, more than banking.
Bringing together thought leaders and policymakers under the banner of diplomacy, dialogue, and diversity, Doha Forum will reconvene for its 20th edition in March 2022 to discuss transforming for a new era.
Coronavirus. To get daily news updates in your inbox, sign up for the CNN newsletter. Coronavirus. Fact versus fiction.
I'm Don Lemon. We're back now live in Lviv. And as Anna just mentioned moments ago, we're just minutes away from President Biden's press conference. We're going to bring that to you live. That press conference has been moved up, and we'll have it for you in just moments here on CNN. But today, there's more bad news for Russia. Ukraine says a large Russian warship was destroyed in the occupied southern port of Berdyansk. Now you can see right there on your screen now, flames and heavy smoke billowing into the sky. In Kyiv, our CNN teams on the ground captured a barrage of outgoing fire. CNN's Ivan Watson is in the southern city of Zaporizhzhia for us. But first, let's go to our Frederick Pleiken. He is in Kyiv, where Ukrainian forces continue to push back against Russians surrounding the capital. So Ivan, hello to you, or Fred, I should say hello to you there. Listen, you're out there, and well, let's go to Ivan. Ivan, you're in Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, which is about 120 miles from where a Russian warship was destroyed. What more can you tell us about that?
Right. So the local Ukrainian government, it says that the strike came in at 7 a.m. We don't know exactly what weapon it was, but they claim to have destroyed a Russian marine landing ship called the Orsk, which was docked at the Russian-occupied port of Berdyansk. Now, how do we know that? Because Russian state TV, including the English language outlet RT, they broadcast reports with their correspondent on the bow of the ship saying, hey, it has docked here at the Russian-occupied Ukrainian port of Berdyansk. They even listed its cargo capacity, saying that it could carry up to 20 tanks or 40 armored personnel carriers and hundreds of troops. They showed the ship unloading with a crane and armored personnel carrier onto the dock, and perhaps 24, perhaps 36 hours after that report aired, boom, we see dramatic social media footage, uninterrupted, of that ship engulfed in flames. Not only that, but of other Russian warships that appeared to have been docked there, tied up at the same time, right next to it, trying to get loose and leaving, and they were actually on fire, smaller fires, trying to escape that kill zone. So it's a very dramatic strike, and I think that military analysts would argue that it showed just an overconfidence on the part of the Russian Navy to dock their ship there within the reach of deadly Ukrainian weapons. Now, Berdyansk is important in part because it's one of the ways out for evacuees fleeing from that besieged port city of Mariupol, much larger than Berdyansk. And that is where I spoke to one of the Ukrainian defenders who's been holding out for weeks now against a vastly superior number of Russian troops. Take a listen.
It's urban combat. So yeah, that's the street to street, building to building. The enemy trying to block us in the city blocks. We're pushing them back. The enemy have a very, very serious casualties. We're not counting them anymore. We need the heavy anti-air systems first. We need aircraft second. We need artillery pieces, and we need anti-tank guided missiles.
That fighter there, part of a group that is in a very dire situation, again, encircled by many more Russian forces. They're being pounded in that city from land, sea, and air by the Russian military. And even more ominous, there may be more than 100,000 civilians hiding in the basements during this modern-day siege. I met one of them who was lucky enough to escape in a children's hospital here, Dawn, an 11-year-old girl who described how she was shot by Russian soldiers while trying to flee Mariupol, seriously wounded, but fortunately alive to live another day. Dawn.
Oh, wow. Now let's get to Fred in Kyiv. Fred, tell us about the gain Ukrainians are making around Kyiv.
Yeah, well, certainly, Don, it has been another very active day here in the Ukrainian capital. You know, you showed that that photo before of that outgoing artillery. That was from last night, but really the story of this day has been very, very similar. Where we have been hearing outgoing barrages here throughout the city. We've also heard some booms and, of course, those air raid sirens that have almost become a mainstay of life here in the Ukrainian capital, as, of course, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to look out for possible Russian aircraft coming here. We also heard a pretty big firefight throughout the course of the day. That really took a very, very long time and shows just how close the fighting is to the capital city. And I think one of the things important to point out for our viewers is that there are multiple fronts here towards Kyiv. There's the northeast, where the Russians appear to be trying to make another push towards the Ukrainian capital. The Ukrainians, of course, holding them back. But those areas that you're talking about, the ones where the Ukrainians are trying to make some gain, that's in the northwest or towards the northwest of the city, where we've seen them somewhat advance in the past couple of days. And from what we've heard today, as we've been speaking to sources on the ground, they say that those gains appear to be consolidated. We spoke to one official in the suburb of Irpin who says it remains under Ukrainian control. They hold about 80% of that suburb, but they also say that they are still under shelling by Russian forces. So the Ukrainians continue to try to make gains. They are saying they are having some success, but certainly it's some difficult and in some cases slow going, as a really, really heavy war is being waged here around the Ukrainian capital, Don.
Frederick Fleich and Ivan Watson doing incredible reporting on the ground in Ukraine. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. With us now is retired Major General James Spider Marks. He is a CNN military analyst and the head of geopolitical strategy at Academy Securities. General, thank you so much for joining once again. When you see that video of the destroyed Russian warship and the gains the Ukrainians have been making, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells you the Ukrainians certainly are not out of the fight. They've really, excuse me, they've really established an initiative here, and it's just gaining with time. Not certain how this ship was attacked. May have been an anti-ship missile, could have been from a ground-based launched RPGs, or it could have been a raid that took place. But clearly what you can see from the images that you're showing right now is that that ship had more than just was necessary to sustain the ship. It had munitions, it probably had some additional armament, and it had some supplies. This is a significant gain for the Ukrainians. You know, the Russians want to create this land bridge from Donbass all the way down to Crimea and beyond to Odessa. That's one of the strategic objectives here. If you cannot control all the coastline, that's an exposed flank, and the Russians are vulnerable. And this demonstrates that level of vulnerability. This is really a phenomenal effort on the part of the Ukrainians. And frankly, based on what I've seen over the course of the last 3+ weeks, not surprising.
I know you've been watching CNN and these pilots they've been interviewing. A senior U.S. official tells CNN that the U.S. opposes sending fighter jets to Ukraine. But in these interviews with these two Ukrainian pilots that they interviewed this morning, this is what they said they needed from NATO. Watch this.
Using this baby, I'm not efficient. I'm not effective against Russian jets, against Russian fighters. We need Western platforms. Maybe it could be pretty old jets as a platform, but with new missiles and with new radars and other systems to be efficient, not to be afraid, not to be scared of Russian technologies.
So, General, two things. First, tell us what we're seeing there. And secondly, President Zelensky says that he needs fighter jets. These Ukrainian pilots said that they need fighter jets. Does Ukraine need fighter jets? Would it be a game changer?
Don't know that it would be a game changer, but let's review what that pilot just said. That was phenomenal, wasn't it? Here's a guy who has an immense amount of confidence, some world-class training. He was trained in the United States. He's got equipment. He's got an aircraft that he thinks that frankly, is probably not up to the same standards that the Russians are using, but they are acquitting themselves magnificently because of this incredible training. And also what you have in air-to-air and air-to-ground type combat. I think most of the Russian losses are as a result of surface-to-air missiles, not necessarily because of direct engagement by Ukrainian aircraft. What that means is the Ukrainian aircraft, they know how to fight the air-to-ground battle, and they're moving these Russian pilots and these Russian aircraft into what's called air ambushes, where they fly over surface-to-air missile locations, and suddenly the Russian aircraft are getting lit up because these Ukrainians know how to do it. The Russians do not have that capacity. They may know how to fly an aircraft, but they don't understand the purpose that that aircraft can provide to the totality of the fight, this two-dimensional fight, which is what it's all about.
All right. General, thank you. Appreciate it. We'll see you very soon here on CNN. I want to get now to my colleague, Wolf Blitzer. He is in Brussels. Wolf.
All right, Don, thank you very much. Yes, we're here in Brussels, right across, right in front of the European Union, the European Council areas where the president has been holding summit talks as well. He's over at NATO headquarters right now. I just came from there. He is about to have this news conference. We expect to learn new information from the President of the United States in the next few minutes. This is a truly historic moment at stake. The population of Ukraine, but about 44 million people live there. Maybe 10 million have been displaced already from their homes. 3.5 million of them have actually fled the country. We're watching what's going on. Phil Mattingly is our White House correspondent. Phil, you're getting more information from your sources about what we should anticipate here. Tell our viewers what you're learning, what we should brace to hear from the president.
Wolf, I think one of the interesting elements is this press conference is going to be earlier than we expected it to. In fact, the trio of kind of snap summits that the president was having back to back to back, or scheduled to have back to back to back over the course of the day, appears to have been thrown off a little bit. He met with NATO leaders this morning. He met with G7 leaders earlier today. But something, Wolf, that you know very well that happens at summits like this, or happens at international engagements, is there are side meetings. And I think the president has had a side meeting on the sidelines with French President Emmanuel Macron, obviously a critical player, somebody who's been having regular direct communications with Russian President Putin, as well as President Zelensky. Regularly communicates with the White House as well. And he's also spoken with the Japanese Prime Minister on the sidelines. And that's multifaceted, Wolf. Obviously, we've seen the North Korean missile tests that I think brought a lot of concern here with U.S. officials, but also with their international counterparts, certainly with the Japanese. But also, the Japanese have been critical allies when it comes to the Ukraine response. I think some officials, I think, were actually surprised on the U.S. side of things how willing the Japanese have been to really be forward on their front feet in terms of complying and working with and imposing their own sanctions at a very significant scale. So those meetings appear to have at least somewhat bumped things off track a little bit for the third meeting of the day with the European Council. And so we expect the president to have a press conference.
Hold on for a moment. Here comes the president of the United States. He will open with a statement and then take questions.
To all the presses here, you must be getting very tired. Am I the 16th or 17th? At any rate, all kidding aside, thank you for taking the time. Today marks 1 month since Russia began its carnage in Ukraine, the brutal invasion of Ukraine. And we held a NATO summit the very next day. At that time, my overwhelming objective in wanting that summit was to have absolute unity on 3 key important issues among our NATO and European allies. First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance. Second was to impose the most significant sanctions, economic sanction regime ever, in order to cripple Putin's economy and punish him for his actions. Third was to fortify the eastern flank of our NATO allies, who were obviously very, very concerned and somewhat worried what would happen. We accomplished all 3 of these. And today, we're determined to sustain those efforts and to build on them. The United States is committed to provide over $2 billion in military equipment to Ukraine since I became president: anti-air systems, anti-armor systems, ammunition, and our weapons are flowing into Ukraine as I speak. And today, I'm announcing the United States is prepared to commit more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians affected by the war in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes. But we also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families. And we will invest $320 million to bolster democratic resilience and defend human rights in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We're also coordinating with the G7 and the European Union on food security as well as energy security. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. We're also announcing new sanctions of more than 400 individuals and entities in alignment with the European Union. More than 300 members of the Duma, oligarchs, and Russian defense companies that fuel the Russian war machine. In addition to the 100,000 U.S. forces now stationed in Europe to defend NATO territory, NATO established, as you already know, 4 new battle groups in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia to reinforce the Eastern Front. Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January, it was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. We've built that same unity with the European Union and with the leading democracies of the G7, in the G7. So I want to thank you, and I'll be now happy to take your questions. Since there's so many people out there, been given a list. Now, how about Chris of the Associated Press? First question.
Hi, thank you, Mr. President. So you've warned about the real threat of chemical weapons being used. Have you gathered specific intelligence that suggests that President Putin is deploying these weapons, moving them to position, or considering their use? And would the U.S. or NATO respond with military action if he did use chemical weapons?
You know, on the first question, I can't answer that. I'm not going to give you intelligence data, number one. Number two, we would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use. Josh of Bloomberg.
Perhaps I'll just project, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
If I had your voice, I'd have been elected a lot earlier.
I'll give it a try. He's got a long arm. Thank you. Can you talk to us about 2 things, sir? One, since your conversation with President Xi of China, have you seen any indications of action or lack of action from China that has led you to believe whether they will intervene and help Russia, either with the sale of arms or the provision of supplies to support this war in Ukraine? And secondly, can you say whether the conversation today turned to the subject of food shortages and what the U.S. will do to address wheat shortages in particular as a result of this war? Thank you.
On the first question relating to President Xi Jinping of China, I had a very straightforward conversation with Xi now, I guess it's 6 days ago, 7 days ago, in that range. And I made it clear to him, I made no threats, but I made it clear to him that make sure he understood the consequences of him helping Russia, as had been reported and as what it was expected. And I made no threats, but I pointed out the number of American and foreign corporations that left Russia as a consequence of their barbaric behavior. And I indicated that I knew how much he, because we had long discussions in the past about his interest in making sure he had economic relations and economic growth with Europe and the United States, and indicated that he'd be putting himself at significant jeopardy in those aims if, in fact, he were to move forward. I am not going to comment on any detail about what we know or don't know as a consequence of that conversation. But tomorrow or next Monday that Ursula is having that conference with China, the 1st, on April 1st. We've had discussions because I think that China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. And so I'm hopeful that he does not get engaged. We also did discuss today that there's a need for us to set up, NATO to set up, and the EU, to set up a system whereby we have an organization looking at who has violated any of the sanctions and where and when and how they violated them. And that's something we're going to put in train. It's not done yet. So with regard to Xi, I have nothing more to report. With regard to food shortages, yes, we did talk about food shortages. And it's going to be real. The price of these sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia. It's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well. And because both Russia and Ukraine have been the breadbasket of Europe in terms of wheat, for example, just to give one example. But we had a long discussion in the G7 with both the United States, which has a significant, the third largest producer of wheat in the world, as well as Canada, which is also a major, major producer. And we both talked about how we could increase and disseminate more rapidly food shortages. In addition to that, we talked about urging all the European countries and everyone else to end trade restrictions on sending limitations on sending food abroad. And so we are in the process of working out with our European friends what it would take to help alleviate the concerns relative to food shortages. We also talked about a significant major U.S. investment, among others, in terms of providing for the need for humanitarian assistance, including food, as we move forward. Tarina of the Wall Street Journal. Watch out, you don't get hit in the head there now.
Mr. President, in your view, does President Zelensky need to cede any Ukrainian territory in order to gain a ceasefire with Russia, or is that completely off the table? And then also, do you think that Russia needs to be removed from the G20?
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility, if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe. With regard to, what was the first question?
If you think that Ukraine needs to cease, to give up any territory in order to get a ceasefire.
That is a total judgment based on Ukraine. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. I don't believe that they're going to have to do that, but that's a judgment. There's negotiations, that are discussions, I should say, that have taken place that I have not been part of, including the Ukrainians, and it's their judgment to make. Cecilia, ABC. There you are.
Oh, thank you. Sir, you've made it very clear in this conflict that you do not want to see World War III. But is it possible that in expressing that so early that you were too quick to rule out direct military intervention in this war? Could Putin have been emboldened knowing that you are not going to get involved directly in this conflict?
No and no.
And to clarify on chemical weapons, if chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, would that trigger a military response from NATO?
It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
And my final question, because you're heading to Poland tomorrow, do you think that getting a first-hand look at the effects of this war on these millions of Ukrainians who have fled their country could change the way that you might respond?
I don't think so, because I've been to many, many war zones. I've been in refugee camps. I've been in war zones for the last 15 years, and it's devastating. And but the thing you look at the most is you see these young children. You see children without parents that are in those camps or in refugees. You see women and husbands, men and women who are completely lost and have no knowledge. You see the look, that blank look on their face, that absolute feeling of, my God, where am I? What's going to happen to me? And so what it will do, it will reinforce my commitment to have the United States make sure we are a major piece of dealing with the relocation of all those folks, as well as humanitarian assistance needed both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. For example, this is not something that Poland or Romania or Germany should carry on their own. This is an international responsibility. The United States, as a leader, one of the leaders in the international community, has an obligation to be engaged. to be engaged and do all we can to ease the suffering and pain of innocent women and children and men, for that matter, throughout Ukraine, and those who have made it across the border. I plan on attempting to see those folks, as well as I hope I'm going to be able to see, I guess I'm not supposed to say where I'm going, am I? But anyway, I hope I get to see a lot of people. Marcus of Der Spiegel.
Thanks, Mr. President. There's a presidential election coming up in 2024, and as you know, there are yes, that's true. And there are widespread concerns in Europe that a figure like your predecessor, maybe even your predecessor himself, might get elected president again. Are there any steps, anything you're trying to do and NATO is trying to do here these days to prevent what you're trying to do becoming undone 2 years from now? Thank you.
No, that's not how I think of this. I've been dealing with foreign policy for longer than anybody that's involved in this process right now. I have no concerns about the impact. I made a commitment when I ran this time. I wasn't going to run again, and I mean that sincerely. I had no intention of running for president again. And until I saw those folks coming out of the fields in Virginia carrying torches and carrying Nazi banners and literally singing the same vile rhyme that they used in Germany in the early 20s, or 30s, I should say. And then when the gentleman you mentioned was asked what he thought, and a young woman was killed, a protester, and he was asked what he thought, he said, "They're very good people on both sides." And that's when I decided I wasn't going to be quiet any longer. And when I ran this time, and I think the American press, whether they look at me favorably or unfavorably, will acknowledge this, I made a determination. Nothing is worth, no election is worth my not doing exactly what I think is the right thing. Not a joke. I'm too long in the tooth to fool with this any longer. And so we're a long way off in elections, a long way off. My focus, if any election, is on making sure that we retain the House and the United States Senate so that I have the room to continue to do the things that I've been able to do in terms of grow the economy and deal in a rational way with American foreign policy and lead the world, be the leader of the free world. So, but it's not an illogical question for someone to ask. I say to people at home, imagine if we sat and watched the doors of the Bundestag broken down and police officers killed and hundreds of people storming in. Or imagine if we saw that happening in the British Parliament or whatever. How would we feel? And one of the things that I take some solace from is I don't think you'll find any European leader who thinks that I am not up to the job. And I mean that sincerely. It's not like, whoa, the point is that when the first G7 meeting I attended, like the one I did today, was in Great Britain. And I sat down and I said, America's back. And one of my counterparts, colleagues, as head of state, said, for how long? For how long? And so I don't blame, I don't criticize anybody for asking that question. But the next election, I'd be very fortunate if I had that same man running against me. Thank you very, very much. Whoa. No. Yeah, one final question, right. Hey, look, wait, hold on a second, please. I was supposed to be an hour ago at the European Union meeting and to speak. No, I'm thanking you. So someone I haven't called on before. You. Who are you?
I'm Christina Arfini from CBS. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Sir, deterrence didn't work. What makes you think Vladimir Putin will alter course based on the action you've taken today?
Let's get something straight. You remember, if you covered me from the very beginning, I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. You keep talking about that. Sanctions never deter. The maintenance of sanctions, the increasing the pain, and the demonstration why I asked for this NATO meeting today is to be sure that after a month we will sustain what we're doing, not just next month, the following month, but for the remainder of this entire year. That's what will stop him.
Do you believe the action today will have an impact on making Russia change course in Ukraine?
That's not what I said. You're playing a game with me. I know. The answer is no. I think what happens is we have to demonstrate the purpose. The single most important thing is for us to stay unified. And the world continue to focus on what a brute this guy is. And all the innocent people's lives are being lost and ruined. And what's going on. That's the important thing. But look, if you're Putin and you think that Europe is going to crack in a month or 6 weeks or 2 months, why not? They can take anything for another month, but we have to demonstrate. The reason I asked for the meeting, we have to stay fully, totally, thoroughly united. Thank you.
All right, so there you have the President of the United States, a relatively short news conference, less than a half an hour. He answered a few questions from reporters, made an important opening statement. Once again, we want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm Wolf Blitzer reporting live from Brussels, Belgium. The President making some significant news. We've got our reporters and our analysts all standing by to get an assessment of what we have just learned. I want to bring in Phil Mattingly, our senior White House correspondent. Phil, there's several things jumped out at me, but one of the most important was the president seemed to be hinting that when he heads to Poland tomorrow, he'll be in Poland Friday and Saturday, he may, repeat, may find some sort of way to meet with President Zelensky of Ukraine. Doesn't necessarily mean he's going to go into Ukraine, maybe along the border someplace, but what are you hearing?
You know, Wolf, White House officials have been very tight-lipped about what that schedule is going to look like. There has been some sense that there would be efforts to meet with refugees. Certainly, other U.S. officials, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is the one that comes to mind, have been close to the border, nearly on the border, and met with Ukrainian officials. I think U.S. officials have been trying to figure out how to do this. And, Wolf, you know as well as anybody, having covered the White House as long as you did, that this is a very complex issue when it comes to security, when it comes to footprint. And so what this is actually going to entail, I think, is still an open question right now, but it underscores the efforts that have been put into this 3 or 4 days on the ground here in Europe. As we've seen over the course of the day, the president during that news conference saying a couple things that I think really stood out to me. One, that there would be a response if President Putin decides to deploy chemical weapons. The president would not go into any of the intelligence he's seen related to that, which has been a serious concern of U.S. officials over the course of the last several weeks and a serious point of discussion here in Brussels between NATO allies and the G7 as well. But he did say there would be the response. As to the response itself, the nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use, according to the president. The president also said, in his personal opinion, Russia should be kicked out of the G20. Now, that's a collective decision to be made, and the president said if that was a decision that they couldn't make collectively, then at least Ukraine should be allowed to attend any G20 meetings. But that is another substantial statement by the president as he continues to do pretty much everything in his power to try and isolate the country, or to try and isolate Russia. But Wolf, I think what I was also struck by was at the end, when the president was talking about the overarching goal here. When you talk to U.S. officials, yes, they are unveiling a sweeping new set of sanctions, more than 400 individuals and entities going after economic sectors, making clear the Russian central bank can't do transactions in gold, which is huge for their foreign reserves, but is the overarching goal of maintaining the unified approach that they've had up to this point. And the reason why is this, and the president alluded to it in that statement, this is going to take a long time when you talk to U.S. officials. This is going to be a slog over the course of the weeks and months, and they need endurance in terms of the unity that has been shown over the course of the last 4 weeks. And so more than anything else, yes, there are policy decisions, the humanitarian aid, the commitments on refugees in particular, extraordinarily important given what we've seen, millions of people crossing the border into Eastern European countries. But keeping this alliance together, this kind of unprecedented collection of democratic nations together, sustained, and working together on sanctions that have a real painful impact on their own domestic economies is critical, and that is something that the president has made clear was a point of this trip, but also something that U.S. officials are going to be working on just a pretty much real-time basis over the course of the next several weeks and months, Wolf.
And he also stressed there would be consequences for China if China were to continue to provide extensive military assistance or other assistance to Russia as well. Fred Pleitgen is joining us from Kyiv in Ukraine right now, our senior international correspondent. How do you think, Fred, what we just heard in these opening statements and the question and answer session from President Biden, how do you think they're going to be received where you are in Ukraine from average folks as well as from President Zelensky and the political leadership?